They bulldozed my deck. No warning, no permission, just gone. Karen from the HOA smirked. It violated the rules. But I had proof she was lying. She thought she won. She had no idea what was coming. Let's rewind. I pulled into my driveway, exhausted after a long day at work, eager to kick back on my backyard deck with a cold beer. But as I stepped out of my car, something felt off. The familiar scent of fresh-cut grass had been replaced by dust and the acrid smell of sawdust. Then I saw it. Or rather, I didn't see it. My deck was gone, completely. Not a plank, not a railing, not even a nail was left behind. Where my beautiful wooden deck once stood, a space where I grilled burgers on weekends, watched the sunset with a drink, and spent countless hours unwinding, there was now only dirt, shattered wood, and deep tire tracks from heavy machinery. My fence was dented, and a section of my lawn had been completely destroyed by what looked like a bulldozer. Who the hell did this? My heart pounded as I stormed toward my back door, only to spot a bright orange notice fluttering in the wind, taped to the glass. HOA Notice of Compliance Action. I ripped the paper off the door and read, Your unauthorized deck was deemed non-compliant with community aesthetic standards. As per HOA regulations, unapproved structures are subject to removal at the homeowner's expense. Unauthorized? Unapproved? I had lived here for 5 years. The deck had been approved by the HOA board 2 years ago. I had permits, receipts, and official approval documents. But now it was gone. No warnings, no emails, no letters. Just total destruction. I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached. And then, like the final nail in the coffin, my neighbor Mrs. Garcia peeked over the fence. Her eyes were wide with worry. "Oh, honey," she whispered. "They tore it down this morning. Karen was there. She was smirking the whole time." Karen Patterson, the HOA president. Of course, this wasn't about compliance. This was personal. I took a deep breath, trying to stop my hands from shaking. They thought they could bulldoze my property and get away with it? They were about to regret ever messing with me. I woke up the next morning with a mission. They thought they could bulldoze my deck and get away with it? Not a chance. I spent hours digging through HOA bylaws, property records, and my emails with the board. The deeper I went, the angrier I got. My deck was 100% legal. I'd gotten written approval from the HOA 2 years ago. I had the permits, the signatures, the board's stamp of approval. And according to their own bylaws, any modification or removal of a structure required at least 3 formal violation notices, a chance for the homeowner to appeal, a majority board vote. Karen had ignored all of it. This wasn't an accident. It was a power move. Confronting the queen of HOA. I stormed into the HOA office, my folder of evidence tucked under my arm. The office smelled like cheap coffee and stale air, and behind the desk, looking as smug as ever, was Karen Patterson. Karen, mid-50s, overprocessed blonde hair, a permanent scowl, and a wardrobe that screamed, "I think I'm better than you." She was sipping from a tacky HOA boss lady mug, like she hadn't just illegally destroyed my property. I dropped the folder onto her desk with a loud thud. "You destroyed my deck illegally?" Karen barely looked up. She didn't even flinch. "Your deck was non-compliant," she said flatly, flipping through some paperwork like I wasn't standing right in front of her. "We had every right to remove it." I laughed, actually laughed. "Non-compliant? It was approved by the board. I have the documents. You had no right." I yanked out my copies of the HOA approval, signed and dated, and shoved them toward her. "Explain this." Karen took another slow sip of coffee. "The board recently updated the community aesthetic guidelines. Any structures that do not conform to the harmonious neighborhood image must be removed." I narrowed my eyes. And when exactly was that rule passed? Her lips twitched in a smirk. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. My deck had stood for 2 years without issue. They changed the rules specifically to justify tearing it down. Funny, I said, my voice dangerously calm. I don't remember getting any notice about that. Karen shrugged. We're not obligated to notify every homeowner personally. The new rules were voted on at last month's board meeting, which I wasn't informed about. It was posted in the HOA newsletter, she said, waving a manicured hand. I clenched my jaw. Nobody reads those useless newsletters. So, let me get this straight, I said, leaning forward. You changed the rules without properly notifying homeowners, used that as an excuse to destroy my property, and now you're acting like this is completely fine? Karen gave me a condescending smile. It's already done. You can always rebuild. With HOA approval, of course. Oh, she thought this was over. She had no idea I'd already called my lawyer. Digging deeper. I left the HOA office shaking with anger. They weren't just playing dirty, they were outright breaking the law. That night, I met with my attorney, Mark Reynolds, a guy who loved taking down corrupt HOA boards. Mark was in his late 40s, sharp as a razor, and had handled dozens of HOA lawsuits. I laid out all my evidence, the approval documents, the lack of violation notices, the illegal demolition. He whistled. Wow, they really screwed up. I exhaled. Tell me I have a case. Mark grinned. Oh, you don't just have a case, you have a slam-dunk lawsuit. We're talking property destruction, illegal enforcement of rules, and financial damages. Good, I said, because I want them to pay. Mark's grin widened. Then let's go for the throat. And then he dug even deeper. What we found was worse than I imagined. Karen wasn't just targeting me, she had a pattern. Mark discovered multiple homeowners who had mysteriously lost fences, patios, even entire sheds, all because of sudden rule changes that they weren't notified about. And then the real bombshell dropped. Karen had been using HOA funds to hire contractors, without board approval. She was personally overseeing demolitions, signing contracts, and funneling HOA money into private accounts. I sat back, stunned. So, she's not just a control freak, she's committing fraud. Mark nodded. And when the court sees this, she's going down. The trap is set. The next morning, I did something that would make Karen's blood run cold. I filed the lawsuit, not just against the HOA, against her personally. By the afternoon, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. People were stopping me on the sidewalk, whispering about how Karen had finally pushed too far. Then I got a text from my neighbor, Mrs. Garcia. Karen is freaking out. She just found out about the lawsuit. She's trying to call an emergency board meeting. I smiled to myself. Good. Karen thought she could bulldoze my property and walk away untouched? She had no idea that I had just pulled the rug out from under her. And the best part? She hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. The moment Karen found out about the lawsuit, all hell broke loose. She called an emergency HOA meeting that night, probably thinking she could rally support and crush me before this ever saw a courtroom. She had no idea I was 2 steps ahead. The HOA meeting meltdown. I walked into the community center like I owned the place. The room was packed, homeowners whispering, exchanging uneasy glances. They knew something big was happening. At the front of the room, Karen stood at the podium, her usual air of superiority cracking. Her over-processed blonde hair was frizzed from stress, and her lips were pursed so tight they could snap. The moment she saw me, her nostrils flared. "This meeting is for board members only," she snapped. I smiled. Funny, that's not what the bylaws say. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Homeowners started flipping through their copies of the HOA guidelines. Karen had run this place like a dictatorship for so long she forgot the rules applied to her too. Before she could respond, my lawyer, Mark, walked in. You could hear a pin drop. Mark strode right up to the front, slapped a thick folder of legal documents onto the table and said, "Karen, you and the HOA are being sued for illegal property destruction, fraud, and misuse of funds." The room erupted. Karen's face went sheet white. "That's ridiculous," she stammered. "This is slander, defamation. You can't—" "Oh, I can," Mark cut in smoothly. "And I have evidence, a lot of it." Then he started listing off every shady move she had pulled. Falsified HOA violation notices, illegally hired contractors, destroyed private property without due process, unauthorized use of HOA funds. As he spoke, I watched the board members' faces shift from annoyance to panic. Karen had gone rogue, and they knew they'd be dragged down with her. The HOA board turns on Karen. The board members, who had worshipped Karen like she was some kind of queen, suddenly wanted nothing to do with her. "This is absurd," one of them muttered. "We never approved any of this." Another member, an older man named Frank, folded his arms. "Karen, did you really use HOA money for this?" Karen's eyes darted around, looking for an escape. I was acting in the best interest of the community." "You bulldozed someone's deck without warning," Frank shot back. "That's not best interest. That's abuse of power." Karen was losing them, and I was loving every second. Finally, one of the board members, Janet, a retired lawyer, stood up. "I motion to remove Karen as HOA president, effective immediately." Karen's head snapped toward her. "You can't do that." "Actually," Janet said, flipping through the HOA bylaws, "we can." The vote took less than 30 seconds, and just like that, Karen was out. The arrest. But this wasn't over. Not even close. I had one last surprise for Karen. As she fumed at the front of the room, her hands shaking with rage, the doors swung open. 2 uniformed police officers walked in. Karen's face froze. "Karen Patterson?" one of them said, pulling out a notepad. "We need to speak with you regarding an investigation into financial misconduct and property damage." A collective gasp swept through the room. Karen's mouth flapped open. You can't be serious." One of the officers sighed. "Ma'am, we have multiple reports of unauthorized use of HOA funds and destruction of private property. You're going to need to come with us." Karen lost it. "This is a setup, a conspiracy," she shrieked, pointing at me. "He did this. He's lying." The officer didn't even blink. "Ma'am, if you don't calm down, we'll have to place you in handcuffs." That shut her up real quick. She tried to argue. She tried to fight. But within minutes, Karen was escorted out of the HOA office in front of the entire community. Watching it all crumble. The room was silent for a long moment. Then someone started clapping. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire room burst into applause. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak up for years were cheering. Frank turned to me and shook my hand. "You just did this neighborhood a huge favor," he said. I grinned. "And I'm not done yet." Because now, it was time for the real punishment. HOA was about to pay. Literally. Watching Karen walk out of the HOA office with a box of her belongings was the most satisfying moment of my life. But I wasn't done. The new HOA board, scrambling to clean up Karen's mess, did everything in their power to avoid another lawsuit. They not only paid for my damages, but they also funded the complete reconstruction of my deck. Bigger, better, and more expensive than before. And the best part? They were forced to rewrite HOA policies, limiting their power over homeowners' private property. As for Karen, she sold her house and left the neighborhood in disgrace. And me? I sat on my brand new deck, beer in hand, enjoying the sunset. Justice had been served.